The sound of metal striking stone echoed through the Montana Territory Valley like a church bell, calling the faithful to prayer. But Elias Blackwood was no man of God. He was a man possessed by love. And that morning in April of 1873, he began a labor that would become legend in those parts for generations to come. His wife Sarah stood at the edge of what could generously be called their homestead, her slender hands pressed against her apron as she watched her husband swing the heavy sledgehammer down onto another stubborn boulder embedded in the earth. The sun had barely crested the peaks of the Rockies, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, but Elias had been at it since before first light. Sweat already darkened his homespun shirt across his broad shoulders, and his long brown hair was tied back with a leather cord to keep it from his face. "Elias," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the field, "come have some breakfast. You've been working for hours already." He straightened up, all 6 feet and 4 inches of him, his muscles straining against his shirt as he wiped his brow with the back of his forearm. Even from 30 yards away, Sarah could see the determination etched into the strong lines of his face, the set of his jaw that she had come to know so well in their 3 months of marriage. When Elias Blackwood set his mind to something, heaven and earth could not move him from his purpose. "Just one more," he called back, flashing her that crooked smile that had first caught her attention back in Denver City when he had come down from the mountains to trade his furs. "This one is being particularly stubborn, just like me." Sarah could not help but smile as she watched him return to his work. They had only been married since January, wed in a simple ceremony at the small church in Helena, with just the preacher and 2 witnesses pulled in from the street. It had not been the wedding she had dreamed of as a girl growing up in Pennsylvania, but when Elias had asked her to be his wife after a whirlwind courtship of just 6 weeks, she had not hesitated. There was something about the mountain man that called to something deep in her soul, something wild and true that made her heart race whenever he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. She had left behind a comfortable life to come to this rough cabin in the Montana wilderness, trading her father's prosperous dry goods store for a 1-room cabin with gaps in the walls wide enough to see daylight through. Her mother had wept when Sarah announced her engagement to a man she barely knew, a rough trapper and hunter who lived alone in the mountains like some kind of wild creature. Her father had been even worse, refusing to speak to her for the 2 weeks before she left. But Sarah had never regretted her choice, not for one single moment. Elias might have been rough around the edges, his hands calloused and scarred from years of hard living, but he was the kindest man she had ever known. He treated her like she was made of spun gold, always gentle despite his great strength, always thoughtful despite his limited education. And when he held her at night, she felt safer than she had ever felt in her entire 22 years of life. The boulder finally gave way with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot, splitting into 3 pieces that Elias began hauling toward the growing pile at the edge of what would become Sarah's garden. She watched the play of muscles across his back and arms as he lifted stones that would have required 2 or 3 ordinary men, and felt that familiar flutter in her stomach that she was still getting used to even after 3 months of marriage. When he finally came in for breakfast, he smelled of sweat and earth and the pine soap he used to wash with. Sarah had prepared hotcakes with the last of their molasses, along with thick slices of bacon and strong coffee that could strip paint. Elias ate like a man starved, which he probably was after the hours of labor he had already put in. "You're going to work yourself to death," Sarah said as she poured him a second cup of coffee. "That field is nothing but rocks. It will take you months to clear it." "Then I had better get started," Elias replied, reaching out to catch her hand and pull her down onto his lap. She went willingly, looping her arms around his neck as he nuzzled against her throat. "You said you wanted a garden. You're going to have the finest garden in the Montana Territory. I promise you that." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she held him close. It had been such a simple comment, made one evening as they sat outside watching the sunset. She had mentioned how she missed her mother's garden back in Pennsylvania, how she had loved working in the soil and watching things grow. She had not been asking for anything, just sharing a memory. But Elias had taken it as a solemn vow. The next morning, he had taken her out to a flat stretch of land just south of their cabin, maybe half an acre in size, and announced that this would be where her garden would go. Sarah had been touched by the gesture, but when she looked at the field, Her heart had sunk. The ground was absolutely covered in rocks of every size, from pebbles to boulders as big as their dining table. It would take a team of oxen and multiple men weeks to clear such a field, but Elias had just smiled and kissed her forehead and said, "I will take care of it. You just start planting what you want to plant." That had been 2 weeks ago, and every single day since then, Elias had been out in that field from dawn until dusk, breaking apart the larger boulders with his sledgehammer and hauling every single stone to the edge of the property. He worked with a single-minded determination that was both inspiring and a little frightening in its intensity. "I do not need a garden," Sarah whispered against his shoulder. "I just need you. Please do not break yourself for me." "A man takes care of his wife," Elias said firmly. "You gave up everything to come out here with me, left your family and your home to live in this rough cabin in the middle of nowhere. The least I can do is make sure you have something that brings you joy." He stood up then, setting her gently on her feet, and grabbed his wide-brimmed hat from its peg by the door. "I'm going back out. Should have the northwest corner cleared by sundown if I keep at it." Sarah watched him go, her heart so full of love for this rough mountain man that she could barely breathe. Then she rolled up her sleeves and set to work on her own tasks for the day. There was bread to bake, laundry to wash in the creek, and a tear in Elias's spare shirt that needed mending. The life of a homesteader's wife was never idle. As the days stretched into weeks, the pile of rocks at the edge of the property grew larger and larger, and the cleared portion of the garden expanded steadily. Elias worked with a relentless determination that Sarah had never seen in another human being. His hands became covered in fresh blisters that broke and bled and then calloused over. His shoulders and back took on even more definition as the muscles grew harder from the constant labor. He lost weight despite Sarah's best efforts to keep him fed, his already lean frame becoming even more carved and defined. Other settlers in the area heard about what Elias was doing and came to watch, shaking their heads in disbelief. A few offered to help, but Elias always politely declined. This was his task, his gift to his wife, and he would see it through himself. "That man is going to kill himself," their nearest neighbor, a grizzled old prospector named Dutch Herman, told Sarah one afternoon when he stopped by to drop off some fresh trout he had caught. "I have never seen anyone work like that. It is not natural." "He is doing it for me," Sarah said quietly, watching Elias through the cabin window as he pried up another rock from the stubborn earth. "I think it is his way of showing me that he loves me." "There are easier ways to show love," Dutch grumbled, "like not working yourself to death." But Sarah understood what Dutch did not. Elias was a man of few words, more comfortable in the wilderness than in civilization, more at ease with actions than with flowery speeches. He could not write her poetry or serenade her with songs, but he could move mountains for her, one stone at a time. She made sure to bring him water throughout the day, along with whatever food she could spare. She would sit with him during his brief rest periods, wiping the sweat from his face with a cool cloth and massaging his aching muscles. They did not talk much during these interludes. Elias was too exhausted for much conversation, but the silence between them was comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding. One evening in early May, as the sun was setting and painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Elias came in looking more troubled than tired. Sarah was stirring a pot of stew over the fire when he entered, and she immediately knew something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her wooden spoon and going to him. Elias sank down onto one of their rough-hewn chairs and ran his hands through his hair, which had come loose from its tie and hung around his face in sweaty tangles. "I'm running out of time," he said quietly. "What do you mean? The garden can wait. We have all summer." "No," Elias shook his head. "If you want to have anything growing this year, we need to get seeds in the ground within the next few weeks, and I'm only about halfway through clearing the field. There are still so many rocks, Sarah, so many damned rocks." She knelt down in front of him, taking his scarred and calloused hands in her own smaller ones. "Then we will plant next year. It does not matter." "It matters to me," Elias said, his gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You have been so patient, so understanding about everything. You never complain about the cabin or the isolation or how hard life is out here. The least I can do is give you this one thing you asked for." "I did not ask for it," Sarah reminded him gently. "I just mentioned that I missed gardening." "Same thing," Elias muttered stubbornly. Sarah stood up and pulled him to his feet, leading him over to their narrow bed in the corner of the cabin. "Come, you need rest. You are exhausted." "I am fine," Elias protested, but he let her push him down onto the bed anyway. Sarah began unlacing his boots, pulling them off along with his socks, which were more whole than fabric at this point. "You're not fine," she said firmly. "You are working yourself into the ground, and I will not allow it. Tomorrow you will rest." Sarah. "No arguments," she said, using the same tone her mother had used when Sarah was a child and had protested bedtime. "One day of rest will not make that much difference, and you need it. You are no good to me dead from exhaustion." Elias opened his mouth to argue further, but then closed it again and nodded. "One day," he agreed. "But that is all." Sarah helped him out of his shirt, revealing the impressive expanse of his chest and shoulders, now even more defined from weeks of constant labor. She fetched a basin of warm water and a cloth and gently washed away the day's sweat and grime, taking care around the fresh blisters on his hands and the deep bruise on his shoulder where he had taken a tumbling rock the day before. "You are too good to me," Elias murmured as she worked, his eyes drifting closed. "I love you," Sarah said simply. "That is all." She thought he had fallen asleep, but then he reached out and caught her wrist, pulling her down beside him on the narrow bed. His arms came around her, strong and solid despite his exhaustion, and she nestled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you too," he whispered into her hair, "more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. When I see you looking out at those mountains with such longing in your eyes, it breaks my heart. You gave up so much for me." "I gave up nothing that mattered," Sarah said firmly. "My parents will come around eventually, and if they do not, then that is their choice. You are my family now, Elias. You and this life we are building together." They lay there in the gathering darkness, holding each other close, and Sarah felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with gardens or rocks or anything else. As long as she had Elias, she had everything she needed. True to his word, Elias rested the next day, though Sarah could tell it pained him to do so. He spent the morning repairing a weak spot in the cabin's roof and the afternoon cleaning and oiling his traps and tools. But his eyes kept straying to the half-cleared field, and Sarah could see the worry lines deepening around his mouth. The day after that he was back at it with renewed vigor, and the sound of metal on stone once again echoed through the valley from dawn to dusk. Sarah had begun working on the cleared portion of the garden, breaking up the soil with a hoe and mixing in what little compost they had managed to accumulate over the winter. The earth was good here, dark and rich, and she could already imagine rows of vegetables growing in neat lines. One afternoon, a group of riders came up the trail to their homestead. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness as she recognized the tall figure of Marshal Garrett from Helena, along with 2 deputies. Elias was out in the field, and she quickly wiped her hands on her apron and went to meet them. "Afternoon, madam," Marshal Garrett said, tipping his hat. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen too much. "Is your husband about?" "He is working in the field," Sarah said, pointing to where Elias was visible in the distance, swinging his sledgehammer. "Is there a problem, Marshal?" "Not exactly a problem," the marshal said slowly. "More of a concern. We have had reports of someone doing a lot of work on this property, and some folks in town got worried it might be claim jumpers or troublemakers. Just wanted to check it out." Sarah felt a flash of indignation. "This is our land. We filed our claim properly with the land office last winter. My husband is clearing a field for a garden, nothing more." By this time, Elias had noticed the visitors and was walking toward them, sledgehammer resting on his shoulder. Sarah could see the wariness in his posture. Elias had never been comfortable around lawmen, a holdover from his years living as a solitary trapper when the law was something that existed far away in towns and cities. "Marshal," Elias said neutrally as he approached, "what brings you all the way out here?" Marshal Garrett repeated what he had told Sarah, and Elias's expression darkened slightly. "As my wife said, this is our land. You are welcome to check our papers if you doubt it." "No need for that," the marshal said quickly, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "I can see you are doing honest work here. It is just that some of the townsfolk have never seen a man work like you do. They were concerned, is all." One of the deputies, a younger man with a scraggly beard, was staring at the pile of rocks at the edge of the property with wide eyes. "You moved all those by yourself? There must be tons of stone there." My wife wants a garden, Elias said simply, as if that explained everything. The marshal looked between Elias and Sarah, and something in his expression softened. I see. Well then, I will make sure to let folks know that everything here is above board. You are doing good work, Blackwood. Not many men would go to such lengths for their wives. After the lawman left, Sarah slipped her hand into Elias's and squeezed. Half the territory is going to know about this by the end of the week, she said with a small smile. Let them know, Elias said, squeezing back. I am not ashamed of working hard for my wife. As May progressed into June, the field slowly but surely began to take shape. Elias had developed a system now, working from one end to the other in methodical rows, ensuring that every stone larger than his fist was removed. The smaller pebbles he left, saying they would help with drainage and were too numerous to bother with anyway. Sarah had begun to notice changes in herself as well. Her hands, once soft from her life in her father's store, were now rough and capable. Her arms had developed lean muscle from working the soil and hauling water from the creek. Her face had taken on a sun-kissed glow, despite her best efforts to wear a bonnet. She was becoming a true frontier woman, and the realization filled her with a quiet pride. One evening, as they sat outside the cabin watching the stars come out, Sarah worked up the courage to share some news she'd been keeping to herself for a few weeks. She had wanted to be certain before she said anything, and now she was. Elias, she said quietly, reaching for his hand. I have something to tell you. He turned to look at her, his expression immediately concerned. What is it? Are you unwell? No, nothing like that, Sarah said quickly. Actually, I am quite well. Better than well, really. I'm going to have a baby. For a moment, Elias just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, so broad and genuine that it transformed his entire countenance. A baby? You're certain? As certain as I can be, Sarah said, unable to keep from smiling back. I should be due sometime in late January or early February, I think. Elias let out a whoop of joy that probably echoed all the way to Helena and swept Sarah up into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. When he finally set her down, there were tears in his eyes. I am going to be a father, he said wonderingly, as if he could not quite believe it. We are going to have a child. We are, Sarah confirmed, wiping away a tear of her own. Are you happy? Happy? Elias pulled her close, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Sarah, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. You have made me the luckiest man alive. That night, as they lay in bed, Elias's hand rested protectively on Sarah's still flat stomach, and they talked long into the night about their hopes and dreams for their growing family. Elias vowed to have the cabin expanded before winter, to add a proper bedroom, and maybe even a separate room for the baby. Sarah talked about teaching their child to read and write, about instilling good values and a strong work ethic. Boy or girl, it does not matter to me, Elias said softly. As long as the baby is healthy and you come through the birth safely, that's all I care about. I will be fine, Sarah assured him, though she had her own private fears about childbirth out here in the wilderness, miles from any doctor. But she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the joy of the moment. The news of the baby seemed to light a fire under Elias. He worked even harder at clearing the field, driven now not just by love, but by the need to have everything ready before winter set in and the baby arrived. Dutch Herman stopped by more frequently, always bringing something useful, a rabbit he had snared, some wild herbs he had gathered, once even a hand-carved cradle that he gruffly claimed he had no use for anymore. My wife and I lost our only child in childbirth, Dutch told Sarah one afternoon when Elias was out in the field. That was 30 years ago, and I have kept that cradle all this time, carting it from place to place like a damned fool. But I want you to have it. Put it to good use. Sarah had hugged the old prospector, not caring that he smelled of whiskey and tobacco, and thanked him with tears in her eyes. It gave her hope that there was kindness and community even out here in the wilderness, that they were not as alone as she sometimes felt. By mid-June, Elias had cleared 3/4 of the field, and Sarah could barely contain her excitement. She'd been planning what to plant, making careful lists based on what seeds they had been able to acquire from the mercantile in Helena, and what she thought would grow well in this climate. Potatoes and carrots, certainly, beans and peas, Maybe some squash and pumpkins if there was room. And flowers, she definitely wanted some flowers, even if they served no practical purpose. A woman needed beauty in her life, especially out here where everything was so harsh and unforgiving. Elias's body had changed dramatically over the course of his labors. He had always been strong, but now he looked like he had been carved from granite. His shoulders were broader, his arms corded with muscle, his chest and back a sculpture of defined strength. Even his hands, battered and scarred as they were, had a certain rugged beauty to them. Sarah found herself watching him work more and more, admiring the fluid grace with which he moved despite his size, the way the sunlight caught in his long hair when he paused to wipe his brow. She had always found him attractive, but now there was something almost primal in her attraction to him, seeing the lengths he would go to for her and their coming child. One particularly hot afternoon in late June, Sarah brought Elias his midday meal out in the field, along with a jug of cool water from the spring that fed their creek. He was working on one of the last large boulders, a massive thing that must have weighed several 100 pounds, trying to break it apart with his sledgehammer. "This one is being stubborn," Elias said, breathing hard from his exertions. His shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging to his muscular frame, and his face was flushed with effort. "Maybe you should just work around it," Sarah suggested. "It could be a feature. I could plant flowers around it, make it decorative." Elias shook his head stubbornly. "No, this is your garden, Sarah. It should be perfect." He swung the hammer again, and this time the boulder cracked with a sound like thunder. Elias let out a triumphant shout and began prying the pieces apart, using a long iron bar as a lever. Sarah watched anxiously, afraid he might hurt himself, but finally the boulder gave way and broke into manageable sections. "There," Elias said with satisfaction, wiping his hands on his trousers. "That was the last of the big ones. The rest should go quickly." They sat down together in the shade of a scrubby pine at the edge of the field, and Sarah unpacked the lunch she had brought: cold meat, fresh bread, and some wild strawberries she had found growing near the creek. They ate in companionable silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead against the brilliant blue sky. I have been thinking," Elias said after a while. "Once the field is cleared and you have your seeds planted, I'm going to start on that addition to the cabin. We are going to need more space with a baby coming." "There is no rush," Sarah said. "The baby will not take up much room at first." "Maybe not," Elias agreed. "But I want to have it done before the snow comes. I do not want to be scrambling to build in the cold with you, heavy with child. And besides, you deserve better than one room with gaps in the walls." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. "I've never been happier than I am right now," she said quietly. "Not in my father's fine house with servants and every comfort, not anywhere but here. With you." Elias pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "That makes two of us. I spent years alone in these mountains, and I thought I was content. But then I met you, and I realized I had been living half a life. You made me whole. Sarah." They sat there for a while longer, neither wanting to break the peaceful spell of the moment, but eventually Elias stood up and stretched, his joints popping audibly. "Back to work. These rocks are not going to move themselves." By early July, the field was finally miraculously clear. Sarah walked through it in the early morning light, her feet sinking slightly into the dark soil, and felt tears of joy stream down her face. It was beautiful, a full half-acre of cleared, fertile land, ready for planting. The pile of rocks at the edge of the property was enormous, a cairn that stood as a testament to one man's love and determination. Elias came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, his hands coming to rest over the small swell of her belly where their child grew. "What do you think?" he asked, and she could hear the pride and exhaustion in his voice. "I think it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," Sarah said honestly. "I cannot believe you did this, all of this by yourself with your own 2 hands." "For you," Elias said simply, "always for you." They spent the next week preparing the soil, breaking up the clods and mixing in composted manure that Elias had traded for with a rancher down the valley. Sarah's back ached from the constant bending and hoeing, but she did not care. This was her garden, created through her husband's labor and love, and she would pour her own labor and love into making it flourish. When they finally began planting in mid-July, Sarah felt like she was participating in some kind of sacred ritual. Each seed she pressed into the earth was a promise, a hope for the future. Elias worked beside her, following her instructions on spacing and depth, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he covered each seed with soil. They planted potatoes in neat rows, their eyes toward the sun, carrots and beets and turnips, beans that would climb the poles Elias had cut and set for them, peas that Sarah could already taste, sweet and fresh from the pod, squash and pumpkins around the edges where they would have room to sprawl. And in one corner, a small patch of flowers, zinnias and marigolds and cosmos, that would bloom in riot of colors later in the summer. When they finished planting the last seed, 3 days after they had started, both Elias and Sarah were exhausted but triumphant. They stood at the edge of the garden, arms around each other, and admired their work. "Now we wait," Sarah said, "and water and weed and hope the weather cooperates." "It will grow," Elias said with certainty. "I know it will. Nothing planted with this much love and effort could fail." As if to prove him right, rain came that very night, a gentle soaking rain that lasted until dawn. When Sarah went out in the morning to check on the garden, the soil was dark and damp, perfect for germination. Within a week, she saw the first green shoots pushing through the earth, and her heart soared. True to his word, Elias began work on the cabin addition as soon as the planting was done. He hauled logs down from the mountains, cutting them to size with his axe and adze, notching them carefully so they would fit together snugly. The work was different from clearing the field, but no less demanding, and Sarah worried about him constantly, afraid he would injure himself in some accident with an axe or a falling log. But Elias was careful and methodical in his work, and the addition began to take shape. He built it onto the east side of the cabin, 2 rooms that would give them much-needed space. One would be a proper bedroom for them, and the other could serve as a nursery and storage room. He chinked the gaps between the logs with mud and moss, making it as tight and weatherproof as the original cabin. Meanwhile, the garden flourished beyond Sarah's wildest dreams. The combination of good soil, adequate water, and long summer days made everything grow with an almost frantic vigor. The potato plants bushed out green and healthy. The beans climbed their poles and began to flower. The carrots and beets sent up feathery tops that waved in the breeze. Sarah spent hours each day in the garden, weeding and watering, and simply marveling at what they had created. Neighbors who stopped by were invariably amazed by the transformation, and word spread through the territory about the mountain man who had cleared an entire field by hand so his wife could have a garden. "You two have become something of a legend," Dutch Herman told them one evening when he stopped by with a fresh-caught string of fish. "I heard someone in Helena telling the story just yesterday. Said it was the most romantic thing they had ever heard, a man moving mountains for his woman." Elias looked uncomfortable with the attention, but Sarah just smiled. She understood now that this was his language, his way of expressing emotions that he did not always have the words for. Every stone he had moved, every blister he had earned, every drop of sweat he had shed, it had all been a love letter written in earth and stone and muscle. As summer progressed into August, Sarah's pregnancy became more obvious. Her belly swelled with their growing child, and she had to let out the waist on all her dresses. Elias was constantly attentive, not allowing her to lift anything heavy or work too hard in the garden. He took over the watering in the heat of the day, not wanting her out in the sun for too long. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," Sarah protested one afternoon when he tried to take the hoe from her hands. "I know that," Elias said patiently. "But humor me. I already lost one family before I met you. I cannot lose you or this baby." Sarah froze, the hoe going still in her hands. "What do you mean, lost one family?" Elias looked away, his jaw tight. "It was a long time ago, before I came to Montana." "Tell me," Sarah said gently, setting down the hoe and taking his hands. "Please." They sat down on the bench that Elias had built beside the garden, and slowly, haltingly, he told her a story she had never heard before, about how he had been married once before, when he was just 20 years old, to a girl named Mary in a small town in Missouri, how she had gotten pregnant within months of their wedding, and how excited and terrified he had been. "She died in childbirth," Elias said, his voice rough with old grief. "The baby, too. A little girl. They could not stop the bleeding, and the doctor was drunk and useless. I held her hand while she died, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she listened. "Oh, Elias, I'm so sorry. Why did you never tell me?" "Because it was the past," Elias said simply, "and because I did not want you to be afraid. But I think about it sometimes, especially now. I could not bear it if anything happened to you, Sarah. You are my whole world." "Nothing is going to happen to me," Sarah said firmly, though her own fears whispered that she could not truly promise that. "I am strong and healthy, and we will find a midwife when the time comes. We will be prepared." "I have been saving money," Elias admitted, "from selling furs and hiring myself out for work. When it gets closer to your time, I want to take you to Helena, where there is a real doctor. I do not want to take any chances." Sarah wanted to protest that they could not afford such an expense, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This was important to him, perhaps more important than anything else. "All right," she agreed. "If it will make you feel better, we will go to Helena." The confession seemed to lift a weight from Elias's shoulders, and he pulled her close, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. Sarah held him back just as tightly, her heart aching for the pain he had carried alone for so many years. August gave way to September, and the garden began to yield its bounty. Sarah harvested the first potatoes with trembling hands, marveling at the size and quantity of them. The beans produced prolifically, more than they could eat fresh, so she set about preserving them in brine for the winter. The carrots and beets came up sweet and crisp. The squash grew to enormous sizes, their hard shells perfect for storing through the cold months ahead. And the flowers, oh, the flowers were glorious, bright zinnias in every color imaginable, cheerful marigolds that glowed like small suns, delicate cosmos that danced in every breeze. Sarah cut bouquets and put them in every available jar and tin cup in the cabin, filling their home with color and fragrance. "This is what I imagined," she told Elias one evening, as they sat at their table eating a meal made entirely from the garden's produce. "When I agreed to come west with you, this is what I hoped for. Not the fancy goods from my father's store or the comforts of city life, but this a simple life built by our own hands, sustained by our own labor." "You're happy then?" Elias asked, as if he still could not quite believe it. "I am more than happy," Sarah said. "I am fulfilled." The cabin addition was completed by early October, just as the aspen leaves began turning gold in the mountains. Elias had done a beautiful job, building sturdy furniture for the new bedroom and even installing glass windows that he had hauled all the way from Helena. The nursery was simple but cozy, with the cradle from Dutch Herman standing ready and waiting for the baby that would arrive in a few short months. They celebrated by moving their bed into the new room, a luxury Sarah had not realized she craved until she had it. Having separate rooms made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a real home. Elias had even built her a proper kitchen table with a smooth top and sturdy legs, replacing the rickety thing they had been using. As fall progressed, they worked together to preserve as much of the garden's harvest as possible. Sarah canned vegetables and made preserves, while Elias built a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin, where they could store potatoes and squash and other produce that would keep through the winter. It was backbreaking work, but satisfying in a way that few things were. In late October, the first snow fell, dusting the mountains in white and signaling that winter was on its way. Sarah was now noticeably pregnant, her belly round and full, and she felt the baby moving constantly now, little flutters and kicks that never failed to make her smile. "Do you want a boy or a girl?" she asked Elias one evening as they sat by the fire. He had one hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby kick against his palm. "Healthy," Elias said firmly. "That's all I want." "But if you could choose," Sarah pressed. Elias was quiet for a moment, considering. "A boy, maybe. Someone I could teach to hunt and trap and survive in the wilderness. But a girl would be wonderful too. A little version of you, with your kindness and strength." "A boy first, then," Sarah said decisively. "And then maybe a girl after that." "You are already planning more?" Elias asked with amusement. "Of course. I want a house full of children, 4 or 5 at least." Elias groaned in mock dismay. "I'm going to need to add even more rooms to this cabin." "You can handle it," Sarah teased. "You cleared an entire field of rocks, remember?" November came, bringing colder weather and more snow. Elias made sure they were well stocked with firewood, cutting and splitting enough to last them through even the harshest winter. He hunted regularly, bringing back elk and deer that he butchered and preserved, ensuring they would have plenty of meat. Sarah baked bread and made stews, and generally tried to keep the cabin warm and comfortable as the temperatures dropped. By December, Sarah was large and uncomfortable, finding it hard to sleep and even harder to move around. Elias was endlessly patient, helping her with everything and never complaining about the extra work. He rubbed her feet when they swelled, and her back when it ached. He brought her tea and made sure she was eating enough. "You are going to spoil me," Sarah said one afternoon as he tucked a blanket around her while she rested. "That is the plan," Elias replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. In early January, when Sarah was just a few weeks from her due date, Elias announced that it was time to go to Helena. The weather had been relatively clear, with no major storms forecasted, and he wanted to get her to town before the baby came. Sarah was reluctant to leave the cabin, but she also recognized the wisdom in his plan. If something went wrong, she wanted to be where there was help available. So they packed up their belongings, loading everything into the wagon that Elias had borrowed from a neighbor, and made the long, cold journey to Helena. They took a room at a boarding house run by a kind widow named Mrs. Patterson, who took one look at Sarah's condition and immediately began fussing over her. "You poor dear, out in the wilderness in your condition. Well, you are in good hands now. I have helped deliver more babies than I can count." The next 2 weeks were strange for both of them. Sarah was unused to being in town, surrounded by people and noise and activity. Elias was even more uncomfortable, pacing the small room like a caged animal. But they made the best of it, exploring the town's mercantile and occasionally visiting the small restaurant for meals. On a snowy night in late January, Sarah's labor began. It started with cramps that she tried to ignore, but within a few hours they had intensified to the point where she could no longer hide them from Elias. He immediately sent for the doctor and Mrs. Patterson, and then settled in to wait with Sarah. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Sarah had never experienced such pain, such exhaustion, such desperate focus on the single task of bringing her child into the world. Elias stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her face with a cool cloth and whispering encouragements even when she cursed him for getting her pregnant in the first place. "You are doing so well," he kept saying. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known. Just a little more, my love. Just a little more." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor announced that the baby was coming. Sarah bore down with everything she had left, and suddenly there was a release of pressure and a thin, wailing cry that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "It is a boy," the doctor announced, holding up the squirming, red-faced infant. "A healthy baby boy." Sarah collapsed back against the pillows, utterly spent but filled with a joy so profound it eclipsed even the pain. Elias was weeping openly, tears streaming down his face as the doctor handed him his son, wrapped in a clean blanket. "We have a son," he said wonderingly, looking down at the tiny face with an expression of such pure love that it made Sarah's heart ache. "Sarah, we have a son." "Let me see him," Sarah said weakly, and Elias carefully placed the baby in her arms. He was perfect, 10 tiny fingers and 10 tiny toes, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that would probably turn gray like his father's. Sarah counted everything twice, making sure he was whole and healthy, and then burst into tears of relief and joy. "He is beautiful," she whispered, "just like I knew he would be." "What should we name him?" Elias asked, settling onto the bed beside her and wrapping his arm around both his wife and son. Sarah had been thinking about this for months. "Thomas," she said, "after my grandfather, Thomas Elias Blackwood." "Thomas," Elias repeated, testing out the name. "I like it. Thomas Blackwood, our son." They stayed in Helena for another 2 weeks, giving Sarah time to recover and the baby time to grow stronger before they made the journey back to their homestead. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a godsend, helping Sarah learn to nurse and care for the baby, sharing wisdom passed down through generations. The journey back to the cabin in mid-February was slow and careful, with Elias driving the wagon at a crawl to avoid jostling Sarah and the baby. But they made it safely, and when Sarah saw their little cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, Dutch Herman had promised to keep the fire going while they were gone. She felt a surge of homecoming so strong it brought tears to her eyes. "We are home," she said to baby Thomas, who was bundled in her arms. "This is where you will grow up, little one, in this wild, beautiful place." The first months with a newborn were challenging in ways Sarah had not fully anticipated. Thomas was a good baby, but he needed constant care and attention. Sarah was exhausted much of the time, functioning on broken sleep and sheer determination. But Elias stepped up in ways that surprised and delighted her. He took over most of the household chores, cooking and cleaning and hauling water. He walked the floor with Thomas when the baby was fussy, singing old mountain songs in his deep voice until Thomas fell asleep. He changed diapers without complaint and seemed to find genuine joy in even the most mundane aspects of fatherhood. "You are a natural at this," Sarah told him one evening as she watched him bathe the baby with gentle, careful hands. "I'm just trying not to break him," Elias said with a smile. "He's so small, so fragile. I keep thinking my big hands are going to hurt him." "You would never hurt him," Sarah said with certainty. "You are the gentlest man I know." As winter gave way to spring, Sarah began to venture outside more, baby Thomas bundled against her chest in a sling that Mrs. Patterson had given her. The garden area was still covered in snow, but she could see the promise of it beneath, waiting for warmth and rain to wake it up again. "We will plant again this year," Elias promised. "Maybe even expand it a bit if you want. Thomas can sit in the shade and watch us work." "I would like that," Sarah said. She had missed the garden over the winter, missed the feel of soil under her hands and the satisfaction of watching things grow. By April, the snow had melted and the garden plot emerged, still clear of rocks thanks to Elias's monumental effort the year before. They tilled the soil and added more compost, and Sarah felt a sense of rightness as she pressed seeds into the earth once more. This time, Thomas was there with them, lying on a blanket in the shade, watching the world with his solemn gray eyes. As the months passed, Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby. He had his father's eyes and his mother's smile, and both Elias and Sarah agreed that he was the most perfect child ever born. Elias was utterly devoted to his son, spending every spare moment playing with him and teaching him things he was far too young to understand. "You are going to spoil him rotten," Sarah said one afternoon, watching Elias make silly faces at the baby until Thomas giggled uncontrollably. "That is my right as a father," Elias replied, not at all apologetic. The garden flourished again that second summer, producing even more abundantly than the year before, now that the soil had been properly worked and amended. Sarah spent long, peaceful hours tending it, with Thomas napping in his cradle nearby, or, as he got older, crawling through the rows and getting absolutely filthy. Neighbors continued to stop by regularly, and their little homestead became something of a gathering place for the scattered settlers in the area. Dutch Herman was a constant presence, having essentially adopted Thomas as a grandson. He carved toys for the baby and told long, rambling stories about his adventures that probably were not even halfway true. In the fall, when Thomas was 9 months old and pulling himself up on everything, Sarah realized she was pregnant again. She told Elias one evening after they had put Thomas to bed, and his reaction was just as joyful as the first time. "Another baby," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Our family is growing." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "I'm blessed beyond measure," Elias said. 2 years ago, I was alone in these mountains with nothing but my traps and my memories. Now I have a wife I adore, a son who amazes me every day, and another child on the way. How could I be anything but happy? The second pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways, harder in others. Sarah knew what to expect this time, but she also had a very active toddler to care for. Elias did his best to help, but there were some things only a mother could do. They made the journey to Helena again when her time grew near, this time with Thomas in tow. The boy was fascinated by the town, staring at everything with wide eyes and pointing at horses and dogs and people. Mrs. Patterson was delighted to see them again and immediately claimed Thomas as her shadow, keeping him entertained while Sarah waited for the baby to come. In June of 1875, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret after Elias's mother. The labor was shorter and less complicated than with Thomas, and baby Margaret emerged with a lusty cry and a shock of red hair that must have come from somewhere deep in Sarah's ancestry. "A girl," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion as he held his daughter for the first time. "We have a daughter, Sarah." "Margaret," Sarah said, reaching out to touch the baby's soft cheek. "Maggie for short." Thomas was initially skeptical of his new sister, not quite understanding why she cried so much and took up so much of his parents' attention. But gradually, he warmed to her, and Sarah often found him trying to share his toys with her or patting her head with his chubby hand. They returned to their homestead when Maggie was 2 weeks old, and life settled into a new rhythm with 2 young children. The cabin that had once seemed so spacious now felt crowded, but it was a good kind of crowded, full of life and love and laughter. That summer, with Sarah occupied with the baby, Elias took over most of the garden work. He planted and watered and weeded with the same dedication he had shown when clearing the field, and the garden continued to thrive. Thomas toddled along behind his father, trying to help and mostly just getting in the way, but Elias never lost his patience. Sarah would watch them from the cabin window as she nursed Maggie, her strong, gentle husband, and their sturdy little son, both covered in dirt and completely happy, and feel her heart overflow with gratitude. This life they had built together was not easy, but it was good. It was real and solid and full of purpose. As the years passed, the Blackwood family continued to grow. Sarah gave birth to another son they named Daniel in 1877, and a second daughter named Elizabeth in 1879. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing brood, with Elias adding more rooms and even a proper loft where the older children could sleep. The garden remained the heart of their homestead, faithfully producing the food that sustained them through each winter. As the children grew older, they all learned to help in the garden, and Sarah taught them to value the labor that had gone into creating it. "Your father cleared this entire field by hand," she told them one spring day when Thomas was 10 and the others were trailing along behind him. "Every single rock he moved himself. He did it for me because I wanted a garden." "Why did not he just find a field without rocks?" Daniel asked with the logic of a 5-year-old. "Because this was our land," Thomas explained importantly. He had heard the story many times and never tired of it, and Father does not give up when something is hard. He just works harder. Sarah smiled, recognizing Elias's influence in their son's words. Thomas was growing up to be very much like his father, strong, determined, and kind. Maggie had her father's quiet strength as well, though she was more outgoing than either of her parents. Daniel was the dreamer of the family, always making up stories and imagining adventures. And Elizabeth, their baby at just 3 years old, was a force of nature who seemed to fear nothing. Elias had continued trapping and hunting to provide income for their growing family, but as the years passed, the demand for furs had decreased. More settlers were coming to Montana every year, and the wild places where Elias had once roamed freely were becoming less wild. So he adapted, hiring himself out for carpentry and other labor, building barns and cabins for the newcomers. His reputation as the man who had cleared an entire field by hand for his wife made him something of a legend, and people sought him out for the hardest jobs knowing he would see them through. Elias took pride in his work, but he always made sure to be home for supper with his family, no matter how far away the job site was. On their 10th wedding anniversary in January of 1883, Sarah and Elias stood together in the garden, now dormant under a blanket of snow. The children were all inside with Dutch Herman, who had agreed to watch them for the evening so their parents could have some time alone. "Do you remember when this was nothing but rocks?" Sarah asked, leaning against Elias's solid warmth. "I remember every single stone," Elias said with feeling. "I still have scars from some of them." "Do you regret it? All that work?" Elias turned to face her, his hands coming up to cup her face. Gray streaked his long hair now, and lines had deepened around his eyes, but he was still the strong mountain man she had fallen in love with. "I have never regretted a single moment of my life with you, Sarah. Not the work, not the hardships, nothing. You and our children are everything to me." "I love you," Sarah said, the words as true now as they had been when she first said them 10 years ago. "I love the life we have built together." "I love you too," Elias replied, and kissed her there in the snowy garden, surrounded by the ghosts of all that labor and love. The years continued to roll by, bringing more changes and challenges. In 1885, when Thomas was 14, he announced that he wanted to learn surveying and maybe become an engineer. It was a departure from the life Elias had imagined for his son, but he supported the boy's dreams, even though it would mean sending him away to school eventually. Maggie was growing into a lovely young woman, with her mother's grace and her father's determination. She had taken over much of the garden work, expanding it even further and experimenting with new crops and techniques. Daniel was thriving in the small school that had been established in a nearby settlement, his love of stories and learning making him a favorite of the teacher. And Elizabeth, now 8 years old, had announced that she was going to be a doctor when she grew up, though Sarah suspected that might change several more times before the girl came of age. In the spring of 1887, Dutch Herman died peacefully in his sleep. The entire community turned out for his funeral, and Elias spoke about how the old prospector had been the first real friend he had made in Montana, how Dutch had helped them when they were young and struggling. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the valley, where he could see the mountains he had loved so much. After Dutch's death, Sarah found herself thinking more about the passage of time and the legacy they would leave. She and Elias were both in their 40s now, no longer young but not yet old. Their children were growing up and would soon start lives of their own. What would remain when they were gone? One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah voiced these thoughts to Elias. "Our legacy is everywhere," Elias said, gesturing to the homestead around them. "It is in this cabin we built with our own hands. It is in the garden that still produces food for our table. It is in our children who are growing up strong and capable. But most of all, it is in the love we have shared. That will echo down through generations, Sarah. Our great-great-grandchildren will know that we loved each other enough to move mountains." "You moved mountains," Sarah corrected gently. "One stone at a time." "We moved mountains together," Elias insisted. "I cleared the rocks, but you made the garden grow. You turned this rough cabin into a home. You raised our children to be good people. None of what I did would have mattered without you." Sarah took his hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture so familiar it was almost automatic. They sat there in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue, and the first stars began to appear. In 1889, Thomas left for school in Denver, the first of their children to leave the homestead. It was harder than Sarah had anticipated, watching her firstborn son ride away down the mountain trail. But she was proud too, knowing they had given him the foundation to pursue his dreams. Maggie had begun courting a young man from a neighboring homestead, a hard-working fellow named James, who reminded Sarah a bit of a younger Elias. The courtship was slow and proper, with James coming to supper regularly and always treating Maggie with respect and consideration. Elias approved, though he made it clear that any man who wanted to marry his daughter would have to prove himself worthy. In the summer of 1890, Maggie and James were married in a ceremony held right there in the garden. It seemed fitting somehow, this space that had been created through love, witnessing the beginning of a new love. The entire community came to celebrate, and Sarah cried happy tears as she watched her daughter exchange vows with her young man. "She is too young," Elias had grumbled the night before the wedding. "She is still my little girl." "She is 19, Sarah had reminded him gently, "the same age I was when we met, and she is in love, just as we were." "I know," Elias had sighed, "but that does not make it any easier to watch her go." But Maggie and James did not go far. They built their own cabin just a mile down the valley, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to have their own space. And when Maggie became pregnant the following spring, Sarah was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. Thomas came home from school for the summer of 1891, full of stories about his studies in the city of Denver. He had grown tall and confident, though Sarah could still see glimpses of the little boy who had crawled through the garden rows getting filthy. "I want to work on building bridges," Thomas told them over supper one night, "connecting places that were previously isolated, making it easier for people to move and trade and communicate." "That is good work," Elias said, nodding his approval. "Important work. We could use more bridges out here in the territories." In August of that year, Maggie gave birth to a baby girl they named Sarah after her grandmother. Sarah Blackwood held her tiny namesake and felt the circle of life complete itself in a profound way. This child represented the future, a new generation that would carry forward the legacy of love and hard work. Daniel was 16 now and showed no signs of wanting to leave the homestead anytime soon. He had become Elias's right hand, helping with all the physical labor and learning his father's skills as a carpenter and builder. Elizabeth, at 14, was still determined to become a doctor and spent all her free time reading medical journals that the schoolteacher loaned her. In the fall of 1892, Sarah's parents came to visit. It had been nearly 20 years since Sarah had left Pennsylvania, and the reunion was bittersweet. Her father was stooped and gray, her mother more frail than Sarah remembered, but they had finally decided to see for themselves the life their daughter had chosen. Sarah had been nervous about their visit, worried they would judge her rough cabin and simple life. But as her mother walked through the garden, touching the leaves of the plants and admiring the abundance, tears had rolled down her cheeks. "You have done well, Sarah," her mother had said. "I can see that you are happy, and that is all a mother can ask for her child." Her father had been more reserved, but Sarah caught him watching Elias work on a repair to the cabin's roof, and there was respect in his eyes. Before they left to return east, he had pulled Sarah aside. "I was wrong about him," her father said gruffly. "About your husband. He's a good man, and he's taken care of you well. I'm sorry it took me 20 years to say so." The reconciliation healed something in Sarah that she had not realized was still wounded, and she watched her parents leave with a lighter heart. The 1890s marched on, bringing more changes to the Montana Territory. In 1893, Maggie had a second child, a boy they named Elias after his grandfather. Daniel married a teacher from the settlement school, a bright young woman named Catherine who fit seamlessly into the family. Elizabeth left for nursing school in Helena, the first step toward her dream of becoming a doctor. Through all these changes, the garden remained constant. Every spring, Sarah and whoever was available would plant the same crops in more or less the same patterns. Every summer, the garden would produce abundantly. Every fall, they would harvest and preserve and store away food for the winter. And every winter, the garden would rest under its blanket of snow, gathering strength for the next season. In 1896, Montana became a state, no longer just a territory. It felt like a milestone, a sign that the wild frontier was slowly being tamed. But out in their valley, life continued much as it always had. The mountains still stood tall and purple in the distance, the creek still ran cold and clear, and the garden still grew. Thomas had graduated from his engineering program and was working on a railroad project in Colorado, but he came home as often as he could. He had met a young woman there, a banker's daughter named Helen, and brought her home to meet the family in the summer of 1897. Sarah liked her immediately. She was practical and kind, and clearly adored Thomas. They were married that fall, and within a year, Sarah had another grandchild, a boy named John. Daniel and Catherine had their first child the same year, a daughter named Rose. The family was sprawling now, multiple generations connected by blood and love. In 1899, as the century drew to a close, Sarah and Elias celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary. They were both in their late 40s now, their hair more gray than brown, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But the love between them had only deepened with time. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had never met?" Sarah asked one winter evening as they sat by the fire. The children were all grown and living their own lives now, though they visited regularly. The cabin felt quiet, without the noise and energy of young ones running around. "Never," Elias said firmly, "because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You are as essential to me as breathing." "We have had a good life," Sarah said softly. "We have had the best life," Elias corrected, "and we are not done yet. There are still more years ahead, more grandchildren to spoil, more memories to make." He was right. As the new century dawned in 1900, the Blackwood family continued to thrive. Thomas's railroad work took him all over the West, but he always brought his family home to Montana for the summers. Maggie and James had 4 children now, all of them growing up just down the valley. Daniel had taken over most of the homestead work, with Elias finally starting to slow down and let the younger generation carry more of the load. And Elizabeth had completed her nursing training and was working at the hospital in Helena, though she still harbored dreams of medical school. In the spring of 1902, on a clear morning in April, Sarah stood in the garden and felt time collapse around her. She was 51 years old now, her hands gnarled with arthritis, her back permanently bent from decades of bending over rows of plants. But in that moment, she could see herself as she had been 29 years ago, young and newly pregnant, walking through the half-cleared field while Elias swung his sledgehammer in the distance. Elias came up behind her, moving more slowly than he once had, but still strong, still solid. He wrapped his arms around her waist just as he had all those years ago, and they stood together in the space that had been created through love and labor. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "For what?" "For this. For all of it. For loving me enough to move mountains." Elias pressed a kiss to her temple. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat, every single stone. You are worth all of that and more." They stood there for a long time, two people who had chosen each other and built a life together one day at a time, one stone at a time, one seed at a time. Around them, the garden was beginning to wake up from its winter sleep, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil toward the sun. The cycle continued, as it always had and always would. Their children were grown and thriving, carrying forward the values of hard work and dedication that they had learned from their parents. Their grandchildren played in the same garden that Elias had cleared by hand, not knowing yet the story of how it came to be, but benefiting from it nonetheless. And somewhere in the future, their great-grandchildren and beyond would tell the story of the mountain man who had loved his wife so much that he moved an entire field of rocks by hand so she could plant her garden. As Sarah and Elias walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the morning sun caught the pile of stones at the edge of the property, making them glow like a monument. And that was exactly what they were, a monument to love, to commitment, to the power of one person willing to do whatever it took to make the person they loved happy. The story could have ended there, but life continued on in its messy, beautiful way. In 1903, Elizabeth surprised everyone by eloping with a young doctor she had met at the hospital. They settled in Helena, where they opened a small practice together, making her dream of being a doctor a reality even if it looked a little different than she had originally imagined. In 1905, Elias suffered a minor accident while helping Daniel build a new barn, falling and breaking his arm. It was the first serious injury he had sustained in decades of hard physical labor, and it frightened both him and Sarah. But he healed well, and the incident served as a reminder that they were not invincible, that time was continuing to march forward whether they were ready or not. They began to talk more seriously about the future, about what would happen to the homestead when they were gone. Daniel was the obvious choice to inherit it. He and Catherine loved the land and the life, and their children were already growing up as the next generation of mountain folk. Thomas had his career in the East, Maggie and James had their own homestead, and Elizabeth had her medical practice in Helena. It all worked out naturally, without any conflict or hard feelings. In 1908, they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary with a huge gathering of the entire extended family. There were now 8 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. The cabin could not hold everyone, so they set up tables outside in the garden, now tended primarily by Catherine, but still producing abundantly after all these years. As Sarah looked around at all the faces, children and grandchildren and spouses and friends, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This was what she and Elias had built, not just the cabin and the garden, but this family, this community of people connected by love and shared history. Elias stood up to make a speech, something he rarely did, and everyone quieted down to listen. "That 35 years ago, I met a woman in Denver City who changed my entire life," he began, his voice still strong despite his 60 years. She was kind and beautiful and brave enough to take a chance on a rough mountain man who did not have much to offer, except a strong back and a willing heart. She came out to this wilderness with me and never once complained about the hardships or the isolation. She made our cabin a home and raised our children to be good people. He paused, looking directly at Sarah with those storm-gray eyes that still made her heart flutter. 29 years ago, I cleared a field full of rocks because she mentioned, just in passing, that she missed gardening. It took me months of back-breaking labor, and I'm pretty sure I was half crazy by the end of it. But I would do it again tomorrow if she asked me to. Because that is what love is. It is doing the hard things, the impossible things, to bring joy to the person you love. There was not a dry eye at the tables when he finished, and Sarah stood up to embrace her husband, not caring that everyone was watching. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I have loved you from the moment I met you, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." The years continued to pass, as they inevitably do. Sarah and Elias grew older, their bodies slowly failing them in small ways, but their love remained as strong as ever. They spent their days in a comfortable routine, tending the garden in season, sitting by the fire in winter, spending time with their ever-growing family. In 1912, when Sarah was 61 and Elias was 65, they took a trip back to Pennsylvania to visit Sarah's childhood home one last time. Her father had passed away years before, but her mother was still living, now in her 80s and frail but still sharp-minded. "You chose well, daughter," Sarah's mother told her on their last night there. "I did not think so at the time, but I was wrong. You found real love, the kind that lasts." When they returned to Montana, both Sarah and Elias felt a renewed appreciation for their home and their life. The mountains seemed more beautiful, the air cleaner, the stars brighter. They were exactly where they belonged. In 1915, the world was embroiled in a terrible war in Europe, though it felt very far away from their quiet valley. Thomas came home for an extended visit, bringing his whole family, and they spent a wonderful summer together, 3 generations working in the garden that had started it all. "Tell us the story again, grandfather," John, now 16, asked one evening, "about how you cleared the field for grandmother." And Elias told it again, as he had told it countless times over the years, never tiring of the tale. He talked about the backbreaking labor, the blisters and the aching muscles, the determination to give his new bride something that would make her happy. He talked about moving boulders that weighed hundreds of pounds, about prying stubborn rocks from the earth, about building that massive pile of stones that still stood at the edge of the property. "But why?" John asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why did you do all that when you could have just found an easier place to plant?" "Because this was our land," Elias explained patiently, "and because sometimes the things worth having are the things we have to work hardest for. Your grandmother was worth every drop of sweat, every aching muscle, every calloused hand, and that garden fed our family for decades. It was a good investment." "It was an act of love," Sarah added softly, "the greatest act of love I have ever experienced." In 1917, Elias's health began to decline more noticeably. He had developed a persistent cough that winter that would not go away, and by spring, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. The doctor in Helena diagnosed consumption, and though he gave Elias medicine and instructions for rest, everyone knew what the diagnosis meant. Elias faced his mortality with the same stoic determination he had faced everything else in his life. He made sure all his affairs were in order, had long talks with each of his children, and spent as much time as he could with Sarah. "I am not afraid," he told her one evening as they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the spring chill. "I have lived a good life, a full life. I have loved and been loved in return. What more can a man ask for?" "More time," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I want more time with you." "We have had almost 45 years, Elias reminded her gently. "That is more than many people get, and every single day of it has been a gift." He lasted through the summer, determined to see one more harvest from the garden he had worked so hard to create. In September, as the leaves were turning gold in the aspens, Elias passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Sarah holding his hand. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the state of Montana. Elias Blackwood had touched many lives over his 69 years, and people came from all over to pay their respects. They buried him on the same hillside where Dutch Herman lay, overlooking the valley and the homestead he had built with his own 2 hands. Sarah grieved deeply, as was natural for a woman who had lost her life partner, but she did not drown in her grief. She had their children and grandchildren around her, providing support and comfort, and she had the garden, which continued to grow and produce even in the absence of the man who had created it. She lived for another 8 years, tending the garden every spring and summer, preserving the harvest every fall and resting by the fire every winter. She told stories about Elias to anyone who would listen, making sure that future generations would know about the mountain man who had moved mountains for love. In 1925, at the age of 74, Sarah died quietly one spring morning while working in the garden she loved so much. Daniel found her there, kneeling between the rows of emerging plants, a peaceful expression on her face. They buried her next to Elias, and on the shared headstone they inscribed a simple epitaph: "They moved mountains together." The homestead passed to Daniel and Catherine, who cared for it lovingly. The garden continued to flourish, tended now by new hands but still producing abundantly. And the pile of stones at the edge of the property remained, a lasting testament to one man's extraordinary labor of love. Years turned into decades, and decades into generations. The story of Elias and Sarah Blackwood became part of local legend, told and retold until it took on an almost mythical quality. But at its heart, it remained a simple story about love and dedication, about a man who had cleared an entire field of rocks by hand so his wife could plant her garden. The cabin was eventually added to the historical register, preserved as an example of frontier homesteading. The garden area became a small park where people could come and walk among the same rows where Sarah had once tended her plants, and the pile of stones was left untouched, a monument more lasting than any bronze statue or marble pillar. In the 21st century, descendants of Elias and Sarah still lived in Montana, proud of their heritage and the story of their great-great-grandparents. They would bring their children to see the old homestead and tell them about the mountain man and his sweet wife, about the garden that had fed multiple generations, about the power of love to literally move mountains. And every spring, when the earth warmed and plants began to push up through the soil toward the sun, it was as if Elias and Sarah were there again, young and strong and in love, building a life together one seed at a time, one stone at a time, one day at a time. Their love story had ended, as all love stories must, but its effects rippled outward through time, touching lives that would never know them personally but would benefit from the legacy they had created. The garden that Elias had cleared by hand so many years ago had become more than just a plot of land where vegetables grew. It had become a symbol of devotion, of what one person was willing to do for another out of pure love. It stood as proof that the greatest gifts we can give each other are not bought in stores or wrapped in fancy paper, but are instead the gifts of time and labor and sweat and dedication. And somewhere, beyond the mountains and the sky, two souls who had been separated by death were reunited once more, together forever in whatever comes after this life. They had moved mountains in life, and they would move them in eternity too, hand in hand, side by side, their love as constant as the turning of the seasons and as enduring as the mountains themselves. The story of the mountain man who cleared an entire field of rocks by hand so his sweet wife could plant her garden was complete, its ending written not in tragedy but in triumph, not in sorrow but in celebration. It was a story about the best of what humans can be when we love without reservation, work without complaint, and build without counting the cost. It was, in the end, a story about how the impossible becomes possible when powered by love, and how even the humblest acts, clearing rocks, planting seeds, tending to growing things, can become legendary when done with a pure and devoted heart.